Bishop Matthew Clark came home to Albany often. He knew those 240 miles from Sacred Heart Cathedral in Rochester to Waterford probably blindfolded. And the reason he was drawn here was because of us, but in particular, a certain group of us, most of all. People named Grace and Jane and Julie and Mary Ellen and Margaret and Kathleen. Those nieces of his that were so well known to all of us who grew up with Matthew Clark as our bishop. He wrote about them. He talked about them. He marveled at them. And when he came home to visit them, he was so often so generous to his original diocese. He joined us for days of reflection and retreats. He gave workshops. He never forgot what it was like to be plucked here to become Bishop of Rochester for 33 years. And he came back often to visit his seminary friend and bishop, Howard Hubbard. And you may remember, those priests that are here, that he came to give us a week's retreat at Wyndham back in 2016. And the thing he talked about at that point in his life, 4 years into his retirement, was this. I wrote down what he said. My main job at this point in my life is to spend the rest of my years attending to my memories, to all the memories I have, especially the ones, he said, that bubble up involuntarily. I have to place those memories in the larger puzzle of my life. The time is now for me to try to make sense of it and see how it all fits. And then he said, you will never stop realizing more deeply what value your memories have as you go through the years of your life. The implications deepen as life unfolds. Right here is the home of many of his treasured memories. From 1967 to 1972, this was home. And he asked to be here. He asked Bishop McGinn, may I please have a parish assignment? I really want to be with the people. And I'm sure that everyone here is savoring memories that are so dear to each one of us. I'm savoring so many memories from my childhood growing up in Rochester. I have faint memories of that day in June 1979 when my parents hired a babysitter for me and my brothers so they could go to the War Memorial and see Matthew Clark installed as our bishop. My dad was a recently initiated convert, and my mom went to Catholic High and grew up in the Albion neighborhood of Troy. And so this was a hometown boy coming to our town. He did a tour of the diocese his first 2 years as bishop. He went to every parish. And I remember the day when I was 5 that he came to our parish, that young bishop. I remember his big wooden crozier and his even bigger smile. And during the Song of Sending, as he processed by, as he was so often wont to do, he saw me, a 5-year-old, and came over to engage me for a second, and he touched my cheek with his hand. I was overwhelmed. I turned to my mom and I said, Mom, he touched my cheek. And she said, maybe he gave you a blessing. Maybe you'll be a priest one day. Memories, Matthew Clark told us, get richer as time goes on. They mean more. They mean different things. I flashed to another memory This one when I was 18. And I was one of the over 1 million youth that were in Denver with Pope St. John Paul II and Bishop Matthew Clark. I saw him in Mile High Stadium sitting among us, the delegation from Rochester. And I turned when Mother Teresa came on the stage and saw tears streaming down his face. Memories keep meaning more to us the older we get. His Episcopal motto was, God's love endures forever. And he told us generously that he was so overwhelmed when he got the call, the unexpected call in Rome, that he was going to be the Bishop of Rochester. He said, I'm at a loss for words. And Archbishop Jean Jadot, the nuncio, said to him, Matthew, the Holy Father has chosen you. Trust your gifts. And he is one of those people for whom his gifts were so evident to everyone. All of us could name his gifts. We always say the same thing. What a gentle man. How peaceful. How humble. How joyful. How loving. He taught us that God's love endures forever. And he taught us that love calls for certain things from us, certain actions and certain signs. One of those signs happened right here at St. Ambrose. I'm told that in the late 1960s, when he was a young priest, there was a tragic funeral. One where a young mother was lost and her daughter was so alone in the world. And it bothered Father Clark so much to see that. And he made a private vow to himself that he would spiritually adopt that girl. And he wrote her cards, and he called her, and he was faithful to that vow throughout his years in Latham. And then he went to be a spiritual director at the North American College in Rome, and he continued to write. And then he became the Bishop of Rochester, and he continued to write and to connect. And they've had that connection all these years. The quote that we heard from our Bishop Clark so often was the quote that we religious always read in the Office of Readings every September. The readings on pastors by St. Augustine. He was taken with the line, "For you, I'm a bishop. With you, I am a Christian." And one time, I was having a breakfast with him when I was home visiting my family, and I asked him about that line, and he said, "I've come to pray now every day with that image of God being the potter and us being the clay." He said, "It is really clear to me that God has been shaping my life always. And what's becoming clearer is the hands that God used to shape me were the people. They were the hands that God used." And he always took that image seriously, that he would be made visible to the people who needed to experience God the most. Every Christmas Eve, he celebrated midnight mass at Sacred Heart Cathedral. Often my family would bundle up after going to the kids' mass earlier at night at our parish and then go into Rochester to the cathedral to see that wonderful smiling bishop with the big crozier and the even bigger grin. But the next morning, every year of his episcopacy, he would get up early and go to the Monroe County Jail, where he would celebrate Mass with the inmates. He said, "Christ is in that jail, and I want to make him visible there. And he said, I'm the one who benefits most of all. He said, I get face to face on Christmas morning with the mystery that God came to be with all of us, everyone, without exception. All of his priests have stories of his goodness, all of them different. One priest very generously told me that back 30 years ago, he had a drinking problem that was getting serious. And he had to meet with the bishop about what to do about it. And the bishop told him that he had to go to rehab. And the priest said he was humiliated and he was scared and he didn't know what he was going to do about his addiction because he felt completely at its mercy. And he said that Bishop Clark said, I know it's going to be hard, but I want to promise you something. I'm going to give up drinking this year too. I'm not going to drink alcohol this year. I won't be able to do what you're doing, but I'll make sure that you're not doing it alone. His love poured out. And he showed us that love isn't something we can send someone else to do for us. It's something we have to do ourselves. One of the trademarks of Matthew Clark that everyone talks about, it's the thing that Cardinal Dolan talked about at his funeral in Rochester, is how peaceful he was, that the quality of peace that he had clearly came from such a deep well. And the kind of peace that he had always struck me as a deep comfort with himself. He was comfortable being Matthew Clark. He accepted himself. And I think some of that is the stories that I've heard about his closeness to his family. He loved his parents with his whole heart. And he would spend every summer home from Rome, whenever he could get home, with his sister Helen and her husband Jim and their girls. He was living with them, experiencing their life with them. And I don't know if his comfort with himself preceded that, but his ability to be fully himself and to accept himself as he knew God did allowed him to accept others the same way. And the humility that came from that is something that none of us can ever forget. At that priest retreat in 2016, he told us something so humble. He said, it took me a few years to realize that the first few years of my episcopacy, I subconsciously was always trying to be like Howard Hubbard. He said, I wanted to write like him. I wanted to speak like him without notes. I didn't have those gifts. And he said, finally, it came to me, God already has Howard to be Howard. God needed me to be me. Only someone who's deeply comfortable with God and themselves could share that with a room full of priests, many of whom he went to seminary with. It's very clear that he believed what we heard in that second reading. Friends, we're God's children. What more do we need to know? If I'm God's child, what more do I need to know? And what's coming, we're promised is even greater. But what more do we need to know than that we're God's children now? One of the things he said that I wrote down from that priest retreat is he said, if we realized how reliable God's love is, if we realized how much and how consistently God loves us, all of our problems would be gone. And whatever was left would be so unimportant to be of no consequence. He had many struggles in 33 years as a bishop, and he had so many struggles in life, as we all do. But he handled his struggles with that same peacefulness of knowing that he was God's child, and what more did he need to know? In the summer of 1995, he lost his mother, Grace, who he was so close to. And he wrote about it in his weekly column in the diocesan newspaper, the Catholic Courier. He had a column for 33 years that he called Along the Way. And in this particular week, he told us about saying goodbye to his mother, how the entire family gathered around, and he told us so intimately, so generously, how they did it. He said, the hospice nurse told us that she could hear us and that we should tell her not to be afraid and that we loved her. And so we decided that we would sing to her. And he told us what they sang. He said, we sang Amazing Grace. He said, it was kind of weird because it was 95 in the shade outside, but we sang O Holy Night. And he said, then we sang, You are my sunshine, my only sunshine. And I saved the article all these years where he said this. During the second chorus of that warm, affectionate song, my mother breathed her last and went home to God. At that moment, the music gave way to tears and other expressions of grief. But I have a deep sense that as time passes and as tears subside, the music will swell again, bright and strong, and remain a great consolation and bond to all who were present that night for as long as we live. The words of Matthew Clark when he was in grief, as so many of us are now. I was 20 when that happened, and I cut that article out and I kept it. And later I became a hospice worker, and I thought of Grace Clark, and I thought of You Are My Sunshine every time I walked with someone. It was with me when my own grandparents died, and it'll be with me when I say goodbye to my parents. Many people here in Albany cherish the memory of Father Tom Powers. And when Father Tom got dementia, it struck so many as absurd. The man with the greatest wit, the most wonderful turn of phrase, for him to no longer be able to remember or at times understand. But I remember that Bishop Clark always thought memory was such an important touchstone for life. And I know that it bothered him for his dear friend to have such an affliction. So what do we make of the fact that he had the same? I think one of the things Bishop Clark teaches us with his very rapid decline in dementia and his rather quick departure from us is that in order to love, we don't require anything. We don't require the wit of Father Tom Powers. We don't require any office or any particular role. He even taught us that we don't even need our memories, as important as they are. The last year of Matthew Clark's life, when people would come to visit him at the Sisters of St. Joseph Mother House, he reached a point where he couldn't talk. So he smiled at them with his warm, big smile, the same one that I saw as a 5-year-old when he touched my cheek and gave me a blessing that is with me to this day. In the end, it is the job of the bishop to teach. And he taught us what it looks like to follow Jesus' commandment. There's one thing I ask, he said. Love one another.